All right, so now we shift to a new topic in the course, and this is U.S. imperialism, U.S. colonialism, and how that's going to factor into the subsequent migratory flow of Asians into the United States. Now, we discussed imperialism earlier, and that was in the context of Japan, if you recall, the Meiji Restoration, and that was again the intensive effort of modernization undertaken by Japan in order to thwart the possibility of European imperialism, European colonialism. But when we think about U.S. imperialism and colonialism, well, it's sort of ironic. There's this ironic dimension, and even contradictory one. Um, why is this? It's because, as you may know, the United States started as a colony of the English Empire, and after a period of colonial tension and colonial crisis, the United States, well, before it was the colonies, right, declared independence from the mother country of England. And after that, you had the establishment of the United States of America. So again, America has its beginnings as being anti colonial, anti imperial. Now, in the subsequent decades after the American Revolution until the end of the 1800s, we embarked upon westward expansion, as we noted during the last lecture. And let's recall, we saw that link between westward expansion and the Industrial Revolution, right? Commercial expansion. It's being really the same thing, the same process. But also in that movement westward, the movement of commerce, what stood as an obstacle was exactly the native inhabitants that were there in the West. So, what did this mean in terms of imperialism? Some scholars, in fact, most of them, uh, interpret westward movement itself as, imperial. That is to say, um, they're basically coming in uninvited to these lands in the West, and if it meant the extermination, if not the resettlement and forced settlement in these reservations, well, so be it. Right. Okay, so that's what's kind of ironic about this is we're talking about a shift in American attitude and foreign policy itself, a shift towards overseas imperialism, because what I just described was continental imperialism. So now we're going abroad, but we don't look towards the Atlantic Ocean. We actually look west. So this brings up the question, when we think about westward expansion, did it stop? Did westward expansion cease to occur once we reached the shores of the Pacific in, say, California or Washington? The answer is no. We kept going west. So we're going west across the Pacific this time. All right, so this is what's important to note here is that connection between this adventurism, so to say, in the West, towards the West, excuse me, in the Pacific region. And I'll discuss why the United States looked at the Pacific with particular geopolitical interest. But as I remarked earlier, what's this going to cause is a corollary, so to speak, an extension of this movement west will be exactly an extension going the other way. Okay, so it's going to be in a way a reflex or a reaction to westward movement across the Pacific, and that's going to be the movement of Asians to the United States. Okay, so this is why we're discussing this in the context of Asian American history. Now, as we proceed, it's a good idea to at least get some terms straight here, to establish some terms. And imperialism and colonialism, to be honest, are often used interchangeably. And, there's nothing wrong with using them interchangeably, in my opinion. Now, some other academics might disagree with that. But in everyday language, everyday discourse, if you're discussing imperialism, well, it's okay to use them interchangeably, in my opinion, because the differences are quite slight. But Let's still establish these distinctions nonetheless, even though there's a lot of overlap. Okay, when it comes to imperialism, it's the ideology and practice of expansionism. So here's the notion of violating the territorial space and therefore the territorial integrity of other regions, other countries, other empires, what have you. And in that process, you're coming in uninvited and you are going to take by force, you're going to expropriate, in other words, the land there, as well as the resources, because usually that's a reason for expansionism is to, you know, basically appropriate all the natural resources there, what it has to offer that you don't have in your mother country, right? So you're doing that for the benefit of your country. You're expanding into this region to control it, and the more colonies you gain, the more mightier you become, according to this logic of imperialism back then. So you can see that colonialism is very close in meaning. The control of foreign territory, whereby a country expropriates foreign land, resources, and even native labor, right, for its benefit. For example, the Spanish Empire would colonize part of present-day, Mexico, the Aztec Empire, and what they did is enslave the natives for their labor needs, in order to mine the gold and silver in Mexico, and therefore Spain got really rich off this. Okay, an empire is a political construction in which one state dominates another one, or a series of states. Okay, so these are all closely related, obviously. They overlap a lot. Some people say imperialism is more of the ideology and colonialism is the practice, right? Imperialism is the approach, and then colonialism is the actual effort to realize this ideology. Okay, so here is where we're going to see it applied to U.S. foreign policy. And the question that arises is this. I just mentioned that for the most part, the United States was anti-colonial. And indeed, for most of the 1800s, it would adopt a policy and approach known as isolationism, which we'll discuss in the next slide. And the big question that emerges is, why would the United States make a fundamental change in its attitude and approach, shifting from isolationism to imperialism? And to be specific, overseas imperialism, because as we mentioned, even continental expansion could be interpreted as imperialism during the 1800s. Okay, so that's the big question that emerges at this point of the lecture. Okay, so isolationism. Here is what I referred to earlier. Now, isolationism is basically a stance taken in a country's foreign policy whereby there's no intervention in the affairs of another country. Okay, rather, that particular country decides to focus on its own domestic affairs rather than, affairs abroad. And that, you could say, is opposed to internationalism. Internationalism is the exact opposite of isolationism. That's the attitude and approach whereby a country actively intervenes in the affairs of others in its own foreign policy approach, foreign policy philosophy. Okay, so as I mentioned, the United States, for the most part, during the 19th century, the 1800s, adopted an isolationist stance in its foreign policy. And you can see why this is going to occur. If you know anything about U.S. history, well, for starters, as I mentioned, we're anti-colonial, anti-imperial, but also as linked to westward expansion, what you see during this century, the 19th century, is the United States moving westward. That's what we're doing instead of going abroad. We're focusing upon continental expansion. At the same time, we're focusing on commercial development. And as I've repeated already numerous times by this point, there one and the same, like commercial expansion, it's the same as territorial expansion. All right, so this is actually a time-honored tradition in American foreign policy during this period. Um, in fact, many of our leaders, even the first president, George Washington, in his farewell address, warned the nation of not to get too entangled in the foreign affairs of other countries. And then, well, there's a famous quote by John Quincy Adams in a speech where he says, "We should not go in search of monsters to destroy abroad." Okay, that's a paraphrase. Okay, we should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That's actually more closer. Okay, so that paraphrase is basically a reflection of isolationism, right? Just stick to your own affairs and focus on your own continental, geographical, and economic development, and stay out of foreign affairs. And not to mention that there's this great distance between the United States geographically and the empires of Europe. And during this century, the 19th century, it's really the high point of European imperialism. In other words, their foreign policy was the exact opposite of isolationism. Um, Various European empires were going abroad in search of colonies in other continents. And, in the act, they're expanding their own empire. So you see the English Empire, the Spanish Empire, even though they're dwindling by the 1800s. The French Empire gaining colonies in North Africa and so forth. At some point around this time, in the late 1800s, actually, this point of discussion, Africa is going to be completely carved up and divided among European powers, except for one country, Ethiopia. But all the other areas will be basically divided among European empires. So this is, again, the exact opposite of isolationism. So this is a big reason why we don't get involved. Okay, we are separated from that by this ocean called the Atlantic, and because of that geographic separation, it is easier for us to maintain an isolationist stance because if you could imagine, if you were a European empire or a European country or what have you, your borders are always there close to other countries, and therefore there's a higher chance of you getting involved in the affairs in Europe when you're very close to each other, when you're actually contiguous, right, geographically speaking. That's opposed to being separated, where you could isolate yourself from what's going on in Europe. Okay. So that's one reason for the time-honored approach of isolationism. So just to sum it up, it was a political tradition from even Washington through the 1800s to maintain an isolationist stance. In fact, American leaders saw it as a virtue. Secondly, we're too focused on our own domestic affairs. We want to expand westward, geographic expansion, certainly commercial development, and again, just distance from what's going on among the Europeans in their quest for empire. Okay, so now we have to address the question that I brought up earlier. Why the fundamental shift from isolation to internationalism? And this will be something we engage with the next video.